Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. A 72-hour ceasefire between Israeli and Palestinian forces came into force today. Several ceasefires have been broken in the past weeks, with both sides blaming the other. But Israel now saying that their offensive is coming to a close. Is there hope for a more enduring peace? Meanwhile, the British government suffered a blow today when Baroness Warsi resigned from her post as a Foreign Office Minister in protest at the government's approach to the conflict. The Number 10 spokesman said, "The Prime Minister regrets that Baroness Warsi has decided to stand down. Our policy has always been consistently clear. The situation in Gaza is intolerable, and we've urged both sides to agree to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire." It also became clear yesterday that Prime Minister David Cameron has launched a review of all arms export licenses to Israel in response to concerns about civilian deaths in Gaza. And then in the second half of the programme today, we'll look at the Central African Republic, which has seen renewed bouts of violence. This comes after a ceasefire there, which was signed on the 23rd of July between the anti-Balaka and ex-Seleka rebel groups, broke down. Why has that ceasefire been broken so soon after its declaration? And is there a real threat of the country splitting up? Joining me now to studio to discuss the chances of serious negotiations for a lasting settlement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are Professor Alan Johnson, a senior research fellow at the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, Martin Linton, Director of Labour to Palestine, Professor Manuel Hassassian from the Palestinian delegation to the UK, the ambassador, and on Skype we have Paul Usiskin, a London-based writer on Middle Eastern affairs. Welcome to you all. But first, let's have a look at this VT report.
In the Gazan town of Beit Hanun, residents have been returning home during a 72-hour humanitarian ceasefire. What most of them find is the destruction of entire neighbourhoods. The smell of death fills the air. Electrical poles have been wrenched from the ground, and craters made by Israeli bombings have devastated streets and houses. Men, women and children searched through the rubble for belongings, toys and pictures that stored memories in houses that have now been reduced to rubble. Inshira Masir said her home and that of her 4 married children were all destroyed.
I am destroyed. I'm shocked. I have heart problems. And then I saw our house. We are all shocked. We don't know what to do. Look at our houses and our children. Everything is destroyed. 4 apartments. All my children are stranded in the schools. Where are we supposed to go?
Rescue workers used bulldozers and diggers to look for bodies buried under the rubble. Resident Sultan Ismail said that he simply could not recognise his own neighbourhood anymore.
I couldn't recognize it. I was shocked from what I saw. I was imagining everything except the sight I saw. Anyone who was seen in the street was struck. Donkeys, animals, people, anyone.
Ismail's family is currently being sheltered outside the town in a UN-run school, like some 260 other residents of the Gaza Strip. Gazan human rights groups put the total number of displaced at 520,000, with people also living in private and public premises. The Gazan Ministry of Health said 1,865 Palestinians have been killed since the Israeli military offensive began on July the 8th. And these have been mostly civilians, including over 600 children and women. Israel says 64 of its soldiers and 3 civilians have been killed since the fighting began. Besides the loss of life, the war has cost both sides economically. Gaza now faces a massive $6 billion price tag to rebuild devastated infrastructure. Israel has already lost hundreds of millions of dollars in tourism and other industry, and fears that overall economic growth will also be affected this year.
Well, Ambassador Hassassian, may I begin with you? I mean, now that Israel seems to be pulling back its ground troops from Gaza and saying that it's completed its operation to destroy the tunnels that Hamas was using, do you think there's a real chance for a lasting peace settlement, peace negotiations?
I think this is inevitable. we have to have a political solution to this conflict. You know, we have witnessed so many wars, so many attacks, so many military incursions. The end result, death toll on the Palestinian sides, more sufferings, more humiliations. People have to understand that there has been an occupation and still going on for the last 47 years. We, the PLO, have continuously believed that armed struggle was the solution. We gave up on it in 1988 when we recognized the state of Israel, and we embarked on a peace process. But after 20 years, we look at the end result, more settlements, more land confiscation and what have you, and this did not really bring the two parties closer to a lasting solution. I believe this saga is going to continue again and again and again if Israel does not address the core issues.
Well, let's turn to Professor Johnson on that.
Okay.
I mean, is Israel now willing to address the core issues and end this conflict once and for all?
I think Israel would say it's made repeated attempts to address the core issues, but they've been unsuccessful to this point in negotiations, whether that was at Camp David or at Annapolis or in the recent John Kerry-led negotiations. I think the scenes we've all been witnessing are absolutely terrible. I think everyone will be overjoyed that there's a ceasefire and very hopeful that it will be extended. I think this time both sides are ready to extend the ceasefire. I think there is an opportunity here. If we imagine that at the moment we're in something of a pit, I think there's 3 steps out of it. I think the first is definitely a ceasefire and immediate humanitarian relief for Gaza. I think the second step, though, is something which more and more people in the world community are talking about, which is a new kind of compact. Let's not go back to imposing deterrence by strikes every 18 months to 2 years. That's a dead end. Let's move to something which involves regional actors, which involves the international community. People are starting to call it reconstruction for demilitarization. Possibly a more realistic goal is reconstruction for the prevention of remilitarization.
And what's the third step?
The third step, I think, is if that's successful, if it involves Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority and it's US-led and Israel is on board, and I would say it marginalizes Hamas, which I think is an essential part of moving forward. The third is to leverage all of that into a new attempt at peace negotiations, presumably American-led again, for 2 states, for 2 peoples.
But the last round, the Kerry round, ended partly because Israel refused to stop the settlement process. In fact, it continued building during the so-called talks. I mean, is Israel now prepared to stop this settlement building?
I think last time everyone made mistakes in the talks. I think Israel certainly made mistakes, but I think all sides did as well. I think we have a false impression of those talks if we imagine that they simply went nowhere. Talking to people who are inside the process, they say there was real ground made on several of the important issues. Compromises were made. Martin Indyk, the American lead negotiator, said after the talks process had collapsed, let's hope we can say paused now, he said that he got Netanyahu into the zone of agreement. Now, I don't know what that means exactly, but it sounds positive. We got Netanyahu into the zone of agreement.
Well, let me come back to the ambassador. Yes. Do you think that the progress was made in those talks?
No, I think, what led to all this conflict, again, the escalation of tension, is the failure of the peace process. Now, I don't want to be subjective by saying that Israel has been the reason, but I go back to what Senator Kerry has said and what Martin Indyk has said. It's the non-release of the 4th batch of political prisoners and the non-stop of building of settlements led to the crash of these talks. The Palestinians time and again have accepted to go to the negotiating table without any conditions, except to see the real intentions of Israel to stop building settlements. And that did not stop. And unfortunately, this led to the saga of conflict and the escalation that we see now.
Well, I want to bring some other people into it. Martin Linton, I mean, Israel has had a free ride in the sense that it's always had support from Britain and particularly the United States, which is so important. Do you see that beginning to erode now, that support, the Baroness Warsi resignation in the case of Britain and perhaps also in America as well?
Well, I certainly think that Baroness Warsi's resignation is going to be very significant, and one can only admire her courage for standing down. In her letter of resignation, of course, she said that there were two things that she found morally indefensible. One was the government's handling of the Gaza crisis, and the other was the handling of the whole Middle East peace process. Now, I think David Cameron's going to have 2 difficulties with this. One is in the immediate future about his handling of the crisis, because although he's called for a ceasefire all the time, he said very little about the killing of 1,800 Palestinians, at least 1,200 Palestinian civilians, including 377 children. And some people, including Ed Miliband, have found it really strange that he has said so little about this, and clearly he has some explaining to do. But the other thing that's going to be difficult for him is Baroness Varsi was a prominent supporter of his right from the word go, and she did an awful lot to bring to win support among the Muslim community, and the fact that she's now resigned, I think, will send a very clear danger signal to David Cameron, who has always attempted to include diversity in his appeal, and he now finds his most prominent Muslim supporter abandoning him precisely because of his mishandling of the Middle East peace process. I think that there are many Conservative MPs now who have a lot of Muslim constituents, a lot of British Arab constituents as well, who have been bombarding them with letters demanding to know whether they condemn the Israeli government's attack on Gaza. And I don't think that he can, he can hide away from that issue anymore. It's not, of course, only the Muslim community that care about this. I mean, British public opinion is overwhelmingly more sympathetic to the Palestinians now, and indeed more and more Conservative MPs, who are usually very loyal in their support for Conservative Friends of Israel, more and more of them have come out very critical of the Israeli government. So I think he has very clear signals about losing Muslim support, losing the support of his own MPs in the Commons, and offending public opinion by his failure to speak out clearly about the attack on Palestinian civilians.
Well, Paul Siskin, I mean, that's British public opinion. What about opinion in Israel? I know you used to be very close to the Peace Now movement. I mean, Israeli opinion seems to be very, very strongly behind what Netanyahu's been doing. So, I mean, what constituency is there for serious peace negotiations inside Israel itself, do you think?
Well, I think all of this begins with what really Bibi Netanyahu is looking at today. And what he's looking at is not negotiations necessarily, but how his performance in the last 4 and a bit weeks will play to the electorate, because his eyes are now on the election that's likely to be in spring of next year. So everything that he will now say and do is part of his positioning to look good in the eyes of the Israeli electorate. A very difficult task, because there are many questions about how the war was fought and what its aims were and whether they were achieved. And he has to look good and pitch himself as the guy leading the 3 so-called moderates, himself, the defense minister and the chief of staff, against the rest of the bunch who he would regard as right-wing extremists, including Lieberman, etc. So as war is often regarded as an extension of politics, so now we seem to be at the end of fighting. I certainly hope we are. And what we now have to look at is how the politics of this plays out. If Israel is serious about anything more than waving $50 billion refurbishment ideas for Gaza and calling for deterrence, which means disarming Hamas, that last, I fear, will bring about another round of fighting.
But are there any groups in Israel that are, as it were, to the left of Netanyahu? You talked about people who are to the right of him, like Lieberman and so on. But is the Labour Party or any other group willing to criticize Netanyahu for what he's been doing during this war, or even for starting it, if you like?
Well, I've watched carefully Isaac Herzog, the head of the Labour Party in Israel, who was also the head of the opposition. And in some respects, I found his performance disappointing because he said that he stood behind the government and the army in the operation. But as I said before, politics is politics. And if there were to be a cabinet reshuffle, his positioning is such that he might find himself considered as a new cabinet minister and his party in government.
Well, coming back to you, Alan Johnson, I mean, do you see any pressures within Israel to negotiate seriously? You talked about the ideal of negotiations, but is Netanyahu really the man who's going to do it without pressure?
Netanyahu's reputation has been built on security, that what he cares about most of all is the security of the Jewish state and its continuation into the future. Having said that, he's also the man who in Bar Ilan in 2010 made a speech which said he was for a Palestinian state. Now, that was a Rubicon moment for the Likud, the party to which he comes from. I mean, it's been unheard of before. He stood next to Barack Obama in Barack Obama's 2013 visit and said he was ready to make a historic compromise. Now, I agree that the end of the Greater Israel project, the end of the settlement project, has to be absolutely part of that two-state solution. There's no question about that. I think from an Israeli point of view, they would say, we know that. That's what's part of the negotiations, but we won't commit national suicide. So we need the kinds of security guarantees that we don't feel we've heard so far. And that view, by the way, is not one confined to the right or the hard right. It is shared by Isaac Herzog of the Labour Party. It's shared by Zipi Livni. It's shared by Yair Lapid. It's even though she didn't support the ground operation, Zahava Galon of the Meretz Party was broadly in support of that, which is, I think, where most Israelis are at. 2/3 of Israelis consistently are in this place. We support the two states for two people solution, but we need to be persuaded that there's a partner for peace.
Well, a partner for peace. I mean, there was a unity government. For the first time, Palestinians were willing to talk with one voice, and yet this war started apparently because Netanyahu didn't want to actually have a partner for peace.
Well, there's a problem. Unity is a good word. We like unity. It sounds like a very positive word, but who's inside the unity government? The Palestinian National Movement, I would say, has a choice, which is it can either follow the path of Manuel and Mahmoud Abbas and those who want negotiations, mutual recognition, compromise, a deal and a two-state solution, or it can follow the path of Hamas, which is violence, terrorism, and a commitment to the destruction of Israel. A choice has to be made.
This unity government is a good thing, is it not?
First of all, let's call a spade a spade. This is not a national unity government. It is a government of national accord, meaning there is no Hamas representation in this government. This is a technocrat government which was approved by Hamas to be on board. President Abbas has managed to bring Hamas on board, finally, and to give him the legitimacy in negotiating on the part of everybody now, not only the PLO, but including Hamas and the other factions. This was blown out with Netanyahu not agreeing to that, not accepting to that, finding excuses to escalate again the conflict because he wanted to exonerate himself from any responsibility, shouldering that the peace process was a big failure with Senator Kerry because of his position. And those positions have to change. Now, everybody knows what is the ultimate solution to this conflict is going to be. It's going to be a political solution. And a political solution meaning political accommodation. We have accepted the state of Israel on 78% of the historic part of Palestine. All we are asking is West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem. And even we have accepted for border rectification as part and parcel of a land swap. And all these have been put on the table. We have discussed this several times with many governments, including Labour and Likud and what have you. In the final analysis, now if we look at the situation, the summation of all these talks eventually, it led us into a big disappointment that Israel is not really still genuinely for peace. Now, I agree with Alan, the fact that 2/3 of the Israelis are for a two-state solution. But what are they doing? And this is a democratic country that believes in democracy. 2/3 of their population, almost I would say 70%, were pushing for a peace process for a two-state solution. And now I see the entire Israeli public opinion behind this government with this naked aggression against innocent people. How could you trust the public opinion in Israel anymore?
Well, Martin, I mean, is it time to put some kind of pressure on Israel, either through economic sanctions or some other pressure, rather than just urging them to make a deal?
Well, I think absolutely so. And it's done. This will never be done by the US. Even if Obama wanted to do it, he wouldn't be allowed to do it by Congress. But Britain, France, Spain, Italy, European countries are in a position to do this. And I think it's high time that British politicians realise that merely words of condemnation, saying things are against international law, terrible, etc., that is not enough. It's action that is needed. And we need to take actions in this country that will put economic pressure on Israel. And we can start with the very simple ones, like not trading with illegal settlements in the West Bank, and if that doesn't work, we can remove, do things like removing the reduction in tariffs that goes on all Israeli imports into Europe until they agreed to withdraw the settlements. I mean, these are the kind of steps we should have been thinking about from the moment that the talks collapsed. We should have been putting pressure on Israel, gently at first, but if necessary, more strongly, in order to make them understand that there would be a cost to them if they did not take seriously the need for a...
We're running out of time. Thank you for that. I just want to give the last word to Paul Lusiskin. I mean, you've heard what Martin said, Paul. Do you think putting pressure like that, economic pressure on Israel, will have an effect, or will it make them more resistant to negotiations?
I think at the moment the very notion of some form of united European effort to pressure Israel is far away. And until such a thing actually happens, and we all know what that would necessitate, I can't see that happening. And for the time being, I'm sorry to say, the Israeli Prime Minister, somebody who really doesn't even have his own party behind him anymore, is somehow managing to hold on to his seat. And that's really where all of this begins and all of it ends. Unless Europe is united, I'm afraid you won't see pressure that will change Bibi Netanyahu's direction.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm afraid we've come to the end of this segment of the programme. After the break, we'll be talking about the situation in the Central African Republic. Stay with us.